I love racing games. I also love a good bit of multiplayer gaming with friends, and here comes the problem with those two statements combined. Most people do not love racing games. Most people find racing games a frustrating experience of smashing into walls, having race-ending incidents with other cars, and as soon as anything rear-wheel drive is involved, spinning out in pretty much every acceleration zone. Now, there are exceptions to this. I know few people in the retro world who wouldn't pick up a game of Outrun or Lotus if offered. And Trackmania Nations Forever, well, that's the one car-based game practically everyone I know, even non-gamers, will play. And I've often wondered if you cracked open a laptop on a long-distance train and started suffering from the mania of tracks, whether someone in a distant row would shout, "Is there a server up?" the moment the engine sound started buzzing. But these are not exactly games where you'd plug in a force feedback wheel and come away feeling like the experience you've had was a reasonable approximation of driving an actual car. Wreckfest. This, you would. Although playing it with a force feedback wheel is a physically intense experience I'm not sure I'm ready to relive for a while. Yes, with Wreckfest 2 in early access, I think it's a good time to look at the original. Wreckfest is an actual proper semi-sim racing game, and yet I know people who wouldn't touch a copy of Gran Turismo without stopping to put on nitrile gloves, and yet they will happily play this. But how? I think there are some key things Bugbear Entertainment do differently in Wreckfest that massively increase its accessibility and appeal to the kind of person who'd prefer GTA 5's driving physics over GTA 4's, i.e. pretty much everyone other than me. First, though, a little bit of history. Bugbear's first game arrived in 2001. Rally Trophy combined two trends of the turn of the century: rally games and the brace of vintage racing sims in the wake of Grand Prix Legends. Rally Trophy was smooth, immensely playable, and also a pretty decent sim by the standards of the time, establishing Bugbear as a name to watch in the sim racing scene. Rally Trophy, though, kinda deserves its own video. After that, Bugbear managed to slip out a game about stadium trucks almost unnoticed. Apologies to anyone who did notice tough trucks. I didn't, because my eyes were on the announcement that Bugbear were going to try their hand at the folk race scene popular in their native Finland, where it has a Finnish term I'm not even going to dare to try to pronounce. What arrived in 2004 as Flat Out was not what I had expected. Instead of a serious-minded sim about low-budget motorsport, we got an arcade-style racer with an incredible physics engine where implausible numbers of objects can be tumbling across the map at the same time. Well, implausible for a Pentium 4. Flat Out is a lot of fun, and I do recall getting some non-driving game-minded friends to have a few LAN games, but it wasn't quite the thing. The arcade physics feel too much like Rally Trophy's physics with some odd correcting forces applied. It's a real grind to unlock the fastest cars, and it's a hard sell to a casual player to have a game which is only fun for them in the ragdoll mode and multiplayer. Also, Flat Out, it kind of deserves its own video. A Bugbear-designed sequel followed before the franchise went to other developers, and I probably don't even need to say with not great results here. Bugbear themselves made a Sega Rally sequel and a Ridge Racer sequel, but the latter landed a bit poorly due to being more flat-out than Ridge Racer, and Bugbear found themselves in the early 2010s without a publisher. Undeterred, they continued work on what would be announced simply as Next Car Game, the internal name used for all new racing projects at Bugbear. Well, all new projects at Bugbear full stop, since they were all racing games. Turning to crowdfunding in the absence of a publisher, they launched a Kickstarter campaign in 2013, and it went terribly. With only $81,000 raised against a goal of $350,000, the Kickstarter was cancelled in November, and with no other options, Bugbear threw themselves into a pre-order campaign, and to give something to entice buyers to do that pre-ordering, released a tech demo showcasing the destruction physics available to those who bought in. And what destruction physics those are! Car bodies realistically deform based on impact, and mangled parts crumble away from your car after being ripped off. Yes, in a nod to playability, suspension geometry somehow remains intact through all of this, but it's a visual feast and technically all rather impressive. Wreckfest wouldn't be Wreckfest without its visual damage. That physics demo was, as we say, what the doctor ordered. Possibly at least one doctor did order it, as the next car game early access campaign was a huge success, enough for Bugbear to release a second expanded version of the tech demo. Once early access launched on Steam in January 2014, sales went into overdrive, giving Bugbear what they thought were more than enough funds to finish the game. Or so they thought, because early access started to go badly. The problem was physics. Next car game would have 23 opponents on tight tracks in a full contact form of racing. The physics were currently a strange arcade-style approach where slides seemed to last indefinitely, but were also easy to overcorrect, so when you got punted you'd end up taking a trip halfway across the infield before rejoining in last place. Then probably get punted again trying to take 20th. It took until June 30th, 2015 for the new physics to make it to a public build, followed by multiple hotfixes for all the new problems introduced by that build. But by this point, Wreckfest, as named in October 2014, was starting to feel great, with the early versions of LAN multiplayer a lot of fun. Through 2016, the physics were polished, new cars and tracks were added. Then, everything stopped. Bugbear announced there would be console versions and a new game, Stuntfest, which was a sort of garage mod of Wreckfest, a sandbox to set up vehicle-based stunts. It too came with an early access campaign, one met with much cynicism as, by this point, Wreckfest had been in early access 3 years, with updates slowing down dramatically. While never confirmed, the conclusion it's hard not to draw from this is that with development taking far longer than the originally expected 2014 release, Bugbear had run out of money. It threatened to leave Wreckfest as just another discarded physics object littered along the side of our virtual highways, a promising sandbox with some great tight racing and destruction physics, but no actual game or anything more atmospheric than racing around a track called Tarmac 1 in a car called American Free. Enter Nordic Games. Nordic had started from the ashes of a Swedish used game shop chain, becoming a sort of middle of little of video games, buying unsold inventory from larger publishers, sticking it on pallets, and putting them in supermarkets because, it's hard to resist a cheap copy of last year's FIFA along with your brown cheese. I have no idea if that's accurate, and I apologise to any offended Swedes in advance. If it's any consolation, I owned 2 Volvos, so I've at least contributed something to the economy. That S60 required a lot of spare parts. Nordic branched out from there into publishing, particularly titles which fit between the established niches mainstream publishers rarely ventured outside of. They also took a leaf out of Infogram's book, and started expanding by purchasing struggling and bankrupt publishers who still had appealing catalogues, including Joe Wood, the original publishers of Rally Trophy, and THQ, whose name they used for a 2016 rebrand to THQ Nordic. This would eventually leave the company with a pile of debt, much like the whole Infogrames/Atari mess, but that's a... Look, I'm not going to turn Kinda Deserves Its Own video into a running joke here, and besides, games company financials aren't really my thing. As a developer working on a niche product that appeared from the outside to be struggling, Bugbear must have looked like a natural target, and in June 2017, THQ Nordic announced they would be publishing Wreckfest, eventually acquiring 90% of Bugbear in November 2018. Suddenly Wreckfest was back. The updates started coming, it gained a proper career mode, the cars and tracks started to get names, and the following June the game left early access. But in that time, something strange started happening. When I played it at LAN parties, inevitably with other racing game types, people who don't typically enjoy racing games stopped to go, "Hey, what's that you've got there?" Then they started buying it and joining in. Within a few years, Wreckfest was starting to see the kind of player counts at my usual LAN which are normally reserved for classic FPSs, survival crafting games, and golf with your soon-to-be enemies. It's definitely called that. There are just some typos on the marketing materials. And how has this happened? I think a lot of it is the same thing which nearly killed Wreckfest. 4 years of tweaking the balance between cars feeling good, but not impossible to recover after a single one of the crashes that you will be having a lot of. So let's take a bit of a break here to talk about why ordinary people don't love racing games. There is a level of practice required to, as the phrase has it, get good. at a racing game. It is a very high level, since I've been playing them since I was about 5 years old, and I'm still not good at them. The problem is that for most skill levels below Alien, you're going to make mistakes. In a serious sim, one single mistake can easily be race-ending. Even in less serious games, you only need one big spin to spend the rest of your race alone trying to chase the back of the pack, which is pretty disheartening if it's a multiplayer race that you can't reset to start again. Unless you're playing top-level pro players, in most games a single mistake isn't going to determine the outcome of the entire session, even a major blunder. In an FPS, it's one avoidable death. In a real-time strategy game, it's a setback, but you can probably bounce back. In golf with your soon-to-be enemies, it's the start of an inescapable rage spiral which has you screw up every subsequent hole out of sheer furious anger. Okay, golf is the weird exception. This makes Trackmania an interesting example of a car-based game popular with people who don't like car-based games, because the cost of a mistake there is a few seconds and some wear on your backspace key. Wreckfest manages to do this, despite being a proper full-on racing game, the kind where you would expect a mistake to wreck your entire race, because Wreckfest's entire premise is chaos. Not complete chaos, but enough chaos to act as an equalizer. Good players will still do better overall. The physics are realistic enough that hitting your braking points more consistently, running tighter lines, and having faster corner exit speed will compound over time. And that might sound like not addressing the premise at all, but I think that's what makes Wreckfest great. They've made a racing game appeal to non-racing game people, but not at the cost of that former group. It's still a very good racing game for those of us who do like that sort of thing. You know, the GTA 4 handling people. For the rest of the world, beyond sim racing aliens, making a mistake just doesn't have particularly big consequences here. Half the time, Wreckfest even makes the mistakes fun as your car launches off a berm, scattering tyres everywhere, does the kind of aerial stunt that would get you a lot of points in Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2, then lands without having lost much more time than going wide on a corner would. And the inevitable failure of players somersaulting gently back over the track limits to, if I may steal a phrase, re-safe joinly, also means the better players are not in a situation where they can carve racing lines in perfect and repeatable fashion, because there is no guarantee your chosen apex will not have a car gently sliding across it on its roof. Even the worst possible incident, where you get punted so far off track you're technically in the suburbs, is manageable with a forgiving reset button and the simple equation that if you have a part of the track to yourself, you're much faster than the chaotic pack and will soon catch up to it and be racing again. Even in realistic damage mode, an average car can take a couple of big hits and carry on, and it's a great equaliser for the fragile meta cars favoured by the kind of racer who wants to take advantage of that clear track difference by getting out in front and staying in front. Not so easy if one incident along the way will rip your front wheel off, a common fate for the Hamad RS. And on the flip side, I've had races which I've won, because they did get a bit chaotic and I happened to be in a car which could tank all of the damage. And of course there's always the classic Destruction Derby mode, where you don't have to care about braking points and racing lines at all, just aim at another car and try to hit it. Now I should mention that players who prefer a certain minimum standard of clean racing can find this frustrating, where racing incidents turn into more nefarious things like corner bombing or making a move which was clearly only ever going to take out every car involved, including the instigator. And even I have had the odd race where I've been frustrated by someone much slower than me, repeatedly punting my car off the road every time I passed. And that's before we get to public lobbies, which I've heard described as fitting more in the genre of survival horror than racing game. Perhaps that's why non-racing game folk enjoy it. But still, this is a thing you could say a certain amount of skill issue to, especially when playing with friends. There are definitely routes through corners and even approaches to braking where it's clear anyone hitting you is going to come off worse, and part of the fun of Wreckfest for an experienced player is whether to play it safe or gamble on potentially being launched so far off the track the buses don't run there on Sunday. This might be enough on its own, but Wreckfest has one final ace. Tracks, which themselves are great equalisers. These are your figure eights, your head-on collision zones, your tracks with high-risk stunts and wall rides that can easily convert first place with an 8-second advantage into fifth. At a LAN, these are the ones which draw people in because put a 12-player race on a big projector and they look spectacular. The near misses, the huge collisions, the drama of races that could be decided only a few seconds before the finish. Watching that one player with just 3 hit points left trying to struggle to the finish line without being taken out by a maniac in a school bus. It's like the mindset you take into golf with etc. You know the results are going to feel unfair and frustrating, but it's the enemies we make along the way that count. It takes another level up when you add in all the ridiculous joke vehicles these races can be completed in. Buses are a common favourite, but there's something pleasing about a supervan race or a field full of mobile sofas. And yet all of this within what is, when you put a normal car on a normal track, a really solid racing game. I'd say it's the ability to play multiplayer in some sort of multiple computers in the same room situation without needing to curate the group first that I love. But I have spent hours in single-player Wreckfest. The recognisable but legally distinct cars help. I can't help but enjoy taking an ersatz Granada banger racing, doing a rallycross in a not an Opel Manta, honest, and cheekily making what surely cannot bear any more than superficial resemblance to an AfterVaz product fast. A reputation the latter really did not have in the UK. It feels quite apt that Bugbear have taken a very accessible form of motorsport and created a very accessible racing game around it. All you need to join Folk Race is a cheap car and some safety equipment, an idea so core to the sport that it has a fixed price, where any competitor can offer to buy your car for that after an event, and you cannot refuse, at least if you want to compete in Folk Race again the next week. What this means in-game, with mostly a bunch of junk cars on offer, is that speeds are low, racing is close, and even the fastest of the Class A cars are forgiving enough that a beginner can jump into the rental Hammerhead or Starbeast and have a good time. The game even gives you a reasonably competitive car for every class in multiplayer, without a single lap in career mode having to be raced. You even earn the same XP and credits playing with friends as you do solo, so it's possible to unlock quite a few of the game's vehicles and customise them, although most of the joke vehicles and a couple of good competitive options are locked behind the career mode. And if you're just looking to rack up credits, you can set up your own custom races, including a 60-lap race on the longest track in the game, the Rally Trophy Tribute. Then realise that if you add realistic damage, almost all the AI will have crashed by lap 2, and you can farm enormous amounts of money and experience by wrecking yourself once you're the only one left. It's far more rewarding to set up a 15-lap race on one of the shorter tracks and leave the damage where most of the field can conceivably finish before their car falls apart. I say that because, well, I'm still doing exactly that years after the initial release. Maybe Wreckfest 2 will take over when it's complete, but that's a long time to enjoy a game, and it's possible I may feel nostalgic for the particular combination of magic of the original, even when the new one is around. In saying this sort of thing, normally I have the advantage of time when I cover retro games. It's easy to say people will still play Roller Coaster Tycoon when it's 25 years old because that point in time, much as my brain screams at me not to admit it, is already in the past. But I think Wreckfest might be one of those candidates to eventually become a well-recognised retro game. Every time I play with a mixed group, I remind myself what a fantastic pick-up-and-play experience it is. Maybe servers being switched off will kill it before that point. As far as I can tell, you only lose the tournament mode when it's offline, but there's still the question of whether you'll be able to buy or download it anywhere. Although maybe by then, game preservation campaigns will have seen some results, and it will be a legal requirement that you can play Wreckfest if you want to. Or will have devolved so far into bizarre dystopia that it'll be a legal requirement to play Wreckfest even if you don't want to. Which is not so bad, because it is, after all, the driving game even non-driving game people like. Well, if any of us are still around and still able to play Wreckfest in 2043, let me know if I was right. And if I am, I guess we can get a server up. Non-driving game folk welcome.